On this wet Friday morning in Dublin, the 21st of May. Hare Krishna. I will just chant Jai Radha Madhava, and then we'll talk a little bit about today's verse, continuing on with the chapter in the first canto, Dhṛtarāṣṭra quits home. Okay. Jai Radha Amad Abba Kunja Bihari Jaya Rad Amad Abba Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavala Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Jamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Rad Amad Abba Kunja Bihari Jaya Rad Amad Abba Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivaradhari Yashodanan Dana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Jamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Rad Amad Abba Kunja Bihari Jaya Rad Amad Abba Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivaradhari Yashodanan Dana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Jamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Rad Amad Abba Kunja Bihari Jaya Rad Amad Abba Kunja Bihari. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. A reading from Srimad-Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 13, and as mentioned, Dhṛtarāṣṭra quits home. And today we are on text 34. Pittayupadate pandao sarvana suridashisun arakshatam vyasanta Pitrivau kakatovita Pittayupadate pandao sarvana suridashisun arakshatam vyasanta Pitriyau kau katavita Pitayupadate pandau Sarvana suridashisun Arakshatam vyasanta Pitriyau kau katavita Pitayupadate pandau Sarvana suridashisun Arakshatam vyasanta Pitriyau kau katavita Pitayupadate pandau Sarvan nasuridashisun Arakshatam vyasanta Pitriyau kau katavita Pitari, upon my father, Uparate, falling down, Pandau, Maharaj Pandu, Sarvan, all, Na, of us, Surida, well-wishers, Shisun, small children, Arakshatam, protected, Vyasanta, from all kinds of dangers. Pitrivyau, uncles. Qua, where. Gatau, have departed. Ita, from this place. Translation. When my father, Pandu, fell down, and we were all small children, these two uncles gave us protection from all kinds of calamities. They were always our good well-wishers. Alas, where have they gone from here? And today there's no purport, but I guess I can speak just on the verse, which I'll read again. When my father, Pandu, fell down, and we were all small children, these two uncles gave us protection from all kinds of calamities. They were always our good well-wishers. Alas, where have they gone from here? Om Ajana Timarandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshu Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swaya Rupa Gadamayam Dadati Swabhidante Kam Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Jai Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. So just reading that translation again, going through it kind of word by word really, certainly line by line. When my father, King Pandu, fell down, and falling down means that he left this world, and we were all small children. So I can actually kind of have a personal connection or relation to what is being expressed here by Maharaj Yudhisthira, insofar as I'm not sure exactly how old Yudhisthira and his brothers were, but he says small children, so they were relatively young. So I also lost a parent when I was quite young. When I was 12, my mum passed away. Excuse me, my mum passed away. So I can certainly speak for myself. I can certainly speak from that personal experience in terms of it being very traumatic, and I kind of imagine that it will remain the most traumatic experience for me in my life, aside from my own passing, which I guess will be something I'll identify with as well. although hopefully with a little bit of luck and a little bit of mercy from Krishna and his devotees, that I'll hopefully be better prepared for that than my mother was, given that she wasn't a devotee and had no connection to, had no access and connection with Krishna consciousness in this particular lifetime. But it is just a very traumatic experience for the people who are left behind, as they say. So that's the first line. So when his father left, when we were all small children, these two uncles gave us protection. So he's talking now about, Dhṛtarāṣṭra, who has now quit home. And Dhṛtarāṣṭra always felt kind of guilty about the situation with Pandu's sons like Yudhisthira and Arjuna and Bhima, etc., Nakula, Sahadev. And again, because of family attachment, etc., he was, in that sense, more disposed, more inclined, more attached to his own sons, like Duryodhana. So he always felt a little bit of guilt as a result of that, but did look after the Pandavas. You know, he did look after them, having a soft spot for them. So he gave protection like that to them. And then, of course, the other uncle is Vidura, who also gave great protection. That was more in the realm of advice and spiritual guidance, etc. But now both of these have gone too. As we are reading in this chapter, it was Vidura who convinced Dhṛtarāṣṭra to leave home to prepare for leaving this world, which is just, you know, I was going to say standard advice for all of us, but of course, in this material world, it's very much not standard advice. It may be standard advice if we have, again, access to Krishna consciousness and to Srila Prabhupada's books. And even then, it can be, it's not that it's automatic, it can still be challenging. So it was Vidura that convinced Dhṛtarāṣṭra to leave. When Dhṛtarāṣṭra left, his dear wife, Gāndhārī, left with him. And Vidura also left, being of a similar generation, etc., or same generation, similar age. He also left. So now Yudhisthira is experiencing all this loss, if you like, and then says they were always our good well-wishers, so they always looked after them, had a soft spot for them, were well-wishers. And he's asking, where have they gone? And of course we kind of know they've gone to north, to the Himalayas, or Himalayas, as at least I grew up saying the Himalayas, but now a lot of people say the Himalayas. And Vidura likewise has gone now. Like that. So Yudhisthira is experiencing this loss. So just to reflect on, you know, talking about King Pandu, Yudhisthira's father, when he fell down or left this world. So as the king, as a king, of course, in that sense, the king of Bharatvarsh, Pandu was Kshatriya and emperor of the world indeed. And as a Kshatriya, one day he accidentally killed a sage and the sage's wife. Accidentally because, as a Kshatriya, and we won't go into that now, but, you know, each of these varnas, they have their characteristics and their activities that are natural for them and natural and right. You know, it's there's nothing wrong with the duties that they have. And one of the duties of a Kshatriya is that they can hunt like that. And as I say, we won't get into all the details of that, but there are nice reasons and explanations and why it all fits in, etc. But basically, that's one of their dharmic activities. So Pandu was out hunting one day as a Kshatriya, and he came across some deer, 2 deer, and took out his arrow, etc., and he shot like that, shot at these deer. But the deer were actually sages, and they were disguised as deer. And they also were just in the act of intercourse or copulation or conceiving a child. That's just about what they were just about to do. When Pandu shot them, their disguise was lifted, and they manifested as the sages that they were, but they had been shot and they were dying and died almost immediately. But just before doing so, or dying, the sage issued a curse on King Pandu, and the curse was that, you know, if you ever are conceiving a child, attempting to conceive a child, that you will die from doing so, because, and law of karma, you know, that's, you know, the law of karma, basically, you know, that Pandu, and there's history to that too, which I won't get into, but there's history to that too, but in effect, he had shot these deer, even though, as I said, that's kind of okay for him to be doing that as a Kshatriya. But they were disguised as sages, and even though Pandu wasn't aware of that, because that had happened, he was ultimately responsible for it, then the curse came, and the curse was reflecting exactly what the pain that he had inflicted on them, killing them while they were conceiving a child or trying to conceive a child. So now it was that if you try to do that, you will also die. Pandu was distressed at this, because again, another thing about a Kshatriya and kings, even more so, is that they like to have children, so as that the children, and traditionally, that's changing now, but traditionally that would be a son in particular. They would like an heir to the throne to carry on the lineage, etc., and keep the family lineage and name intact and all of that kind of thing. So he was really distressed at this, actually, and we see that throughout history also. You know, different. The king that I learnt about in school a lot was the Tudor king Henry VIII, and his desperation for fathering a son in particular and the kingdom too. And we learnt a little rhyme in school, because Henry VIII had 6 wives, and we learnt a little rhyme in school: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. That was the sequence of his different wives, and I could give a whole talk on that, actually, all of them. But he actually didn't. The first wife, real quick, the first wife had Spanish-French connections, but she was unable to have children, so they couldn't have children. So Henry wanted children, as I said, to pass on the kingdom. So he wanted rid of her, but he couldn't behead her, or he couldn't kill her. It's amazing talking about it. You know, these are kind of, options or whatever. But he couldn't do that, because if he did, he'd likely have started a war between England or Britain and France and or Spain, because of her heritage. That Catherine of Aragon was her name, because of her heritage. So he didn't do that, so he chose to divorce her. I am getting into this, but it is a fascinating story, because he didn't want the risk of war, so he divorced her. But he couldn't divorce her. At that time, there was no Protestant church, and certainly no Anglican church. So Henry approached the representative of the Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Thomas More was his name. And he approached him and he said, I would like a divorce. I've got a problem here. I've got a wife who can't give me children, can't kill her because of her connection with France, Spain, etc. So divorce is the only option. And Thomas More said, no, that's against the teachings of the church, and against the Pope, what the Pope would want. So Thomas More refused. And actually, just as a point of information, later on, Thomas More was also beheaded for refusing Henry to grant Henry. So that, he was very much standing on principle, and he lost his life as a result. Anyway, Henry did have a divorce, but the way that he had a divorce in a nutshell was he broke away from the church. And really interesting about that is that very shortly before this all happened, and before he approached Thomas More to have a divorce, very shortly before all of that happened, this was when Martin Luther in Germany was starting his movement, and his movement was different in the sense that it was kind of based on a principle that Martin Luther and also people like Calvin, etc., their view was that the church in Rome had become, kind of corrupted, and cardinals, etc., were living a high life and all of that kind of thing, and they just felt that it wasn't presenting the core message and wasn't practicing the core principles, if you like, of the Christian tradition, which ultimately were founded in things like, you know, chastity and austerity and all of those kind of qualities, all those kind of practices. So they felt like that, so they wanted to break away. But as I say, at this time, Henry was still very much in the fold and part of the what we would know today as the Roman Catholic Church. So it's interesting that Martin Luther, because the printing press was just being invented at that stage, and I forget what his paper was, but he wrote this paper on why he was starting his own movement, etc., and all of that kind of thing. I can't remember what the paper was called. It was printed in what was known then the first printing press, the Gutenberg press, in Germany. So this was being distributed far and wide. You know, it was the first time that actually something in writing could be distributed, because there was no printing press before that. Prior to that, everything was essentially word of mouth. So this was being distributed widely around Europe, but Henry prevented it. There was one guy, one priest, who was a supporter of Martin Luther, who lived in England, I think somewhere in the west of England, Gloucestershire, and he was Martin Luther was importing, you know, whatever it was, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of this booklet to Britain, so it could be distributed in Britain like that. Henry heard about that, found out about that, and he had it prevented getting into England at the port of Dover, probably, is in the news a lot now. Anyway, wherever it was coming in, Henry managed to prevent it coming in. And as a result of that, when that news got back to the Pope, that's when the Pope awarded Henry VIII the title Defender of the Faith, because he was defending the quote-unquote the Roman Catholic faith and protecting Britain from this heretical message that Martin Luther in Germany was promoting and distributing like that. So that's where he got the title Defender of Faith. But very shortly after, he broke away from the Catholic Church. Why? Not on a point of principle, simply on a point of whatever, you know, convenience, you know, what he saw as his need to have children, and he couldn't, as I say, go to war with France or Spain, so he wanted that divorce. So he broke away from the Catholic Church, created his own church, which is now, today, is the modern Anglican Church, created his own church, all because he wanted a divorce and wanted to marry a new wife, who, by the way, at least as far as the history says, he was already, you know, in an affair with, and her name was Anne Boleyn. Her problem was that she was British, she was English, and therefore Henry had complete control over her. He did father a child with her, but it wasn't a boy, it was a girl. Her name was Elizabeth. So then he needed to get rid of her, so she got beheaded, divorced, beheaded, died. The third one was a lady, also British, called Jane Seymour, but she died giving birth to a son. So she was the one woman who actually gave him a son, but she died in childbirth. The son was weak, he was a haemophiliac, so, you know, when he would get a bruise, he would bleed, etc. like that, and he died very young. He died 13, 14, something like that, I can't remember exactly. So Henry's still stuck. He has this daughter from the second marriage, Anne Boleyn, but he still doesn't have a son. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced. The first one, I think, was a Dutch lady, I think, Anne of Cleves. Again, she couldn't provide a son. He divorced her as a result. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded. So the last one, there was Catherine Parr and Catherine Howard. I'm not sure which one came next, but again, she was English. She couldn't give him a child, or at least a son, so she got beheaded. And then the last one, either Catherine Parr or Catherine Howard, she outlived him, and she effectively, in one sense, became his nurse, although the story goes that they were very, very close, kind of soulmates like that. Anyway, so that was the whole thing with this thing of desiring. And then, of course, because he didn't have a son, so when Henry died, Queen Elizabeth I, Elizabeth became the Queen Elizabeth I, and she's now recognised as arguably the most powerful monarch ever in the history of Britain. So it's kind of interesting. He wanted a son all the time, yet the lady or the girl that he had, she actually became the most powerful monarch in the whole of the history of Britain, which is just kind of very interesting. Anyway, so I did divert there, and my apologies for that. So yeah, we got to the point where Pandu now is all, and Pandu wanted to take sannyas then. Of course, his wives didn't want that, etc., etc. But he died relatively shortly after. One of his two wives, of course, Kunti and Madri. Madri honoured, if you like, her funeral, her sati rites by following Pandu into the funeral pyre, and then Kunti was left, and she raised all the children like that. Of course, you could ask, where did they get children from? Well, Kunti had a boon from Dharmaraj that because of what had happened to Pandu, she could now go to the devas, go to different demigods and have children via the demigods. So, sorry, it was Durvasa Muni that gave Kunti that boon, and Dharmaraj was the first one of the devas that fathered a child with Kunti, and that was Yudhisthira. And then Vayu, the demigod or deva controlling the wind, he sired a child with Kunti, and that was Bhima. And then the last one was Indra. Indra, she also had Indra, who fathered a child with her, and that was Arjuna. And Madri, she had the twins, Nakula and Sahadev. So now Madri and Pandu are gone, and Kunti is looking, because Pandu died at a relatively early age, So now Queen Kunti is left to bring up the 5 Pandava children like that. So, as we just read there, that Yudhisthira was a young boy when he lost his stepfather, but now he's having to deal with more losses. As I explained, for me it was a great loss losing my mother, big loss. But now he has to deal with more losses. So basically his replacement father, if you like, his uncles, they've both left, and one of them along with his aunt Gāndhārī, etc. And actually just before this as well, of course, Bhishma Dev, who was a great influence in Maharaj Yudhisthira's life, he also has left this world. So this is all an awful lot of loss that Yudhisthira, well, all the Pandavas, but in this case particularly Yudhisthira, is having to deal with. And like for instance Bhishma Dev, as I said, he's one of the 12 Mahajans, and Mahajano Yena Gatasa Panta, that Mahajans are people, there's only 12 of them, people, they're great acharyas, and that we should accept the progressive path that they give us, that they're advocating to advance in Krishna consciousness. So that was a huge loss, and that's a whole part of this canto in the Bhagavatam. Bhishma Dev on his deathbed, bed of arrows, and the instructions that he gave to Maharaj Yudhisthira. Remember the most, if you like, or always was so taken by, is the verse that says Nayasha Kahi Chidrajan, that Bhishma Dev is saying that nobody knows the plan of the Lord. He has a plan, but no one knows it. And great sages have meditated on this since time immemorial, but they're none the wiser. Which I always find amazing, because when you read some of the different stories in the Bhagavatam, etc., Krishna's plans sometimes is just extraordinary, how they all interlap and interconnect with different eras and generations and personalities, but they all work out, perfectly, and everyone, it's just extraordinary. So no one knows the plan. So now Yudhisthira is all of this loss like that, and he's suffering as a result, which is perfectly natural like that. Of course, we want to always take it in context that, and Yudhisthira it's not the be-all and end-all, but still, you have to deal with that loss like that you're experiencing. And the best way to do that is through the not the principle, but through understanding, having the real context, understanding that context, realizing that even if you don't know all the details of the Lord's plan, that the Lord does have a plan. So all of these things, help that. Knowledge is so powerful. Knowledge is liberating. If we have no knowledge, then when we lose a loved one, it's like our whole world is falling apart, and there's just nothing to replace it like that. And people can become, we even know that experience, particularly if people have been together, say husband and wife like that, for a very long time, and then one of them passes away, that oftentimes the other one passes away shortly after, and even from a medical point of view, it's accepted that essentially what they died of was a broken heart. So losing loved ones is going to do that. It's like it breaks our heart. But having understanding of eternal time and context then can help us get over that, and really, really actually help us with that, So how to do that? How to actually develop that understanding. So this is losing loved ones, which, as I've expressed, very, very painful. But as I also expressed at the beginning, that that was the most tragic experience in my life, losing my mother, and will remain so until probably I have to leave myself. Although I'm hoping and praying that through, trying to engage in devotional service and trying to surrender to Krishna and chant Krishna's holy names, that I'll be helped with that process. And Krishna gives us that assurance that he'll never forsake those who try to serve him. So losing the loved ones is a real challenge, but leaving our own bodies, and particularly if we don't have any Krishna conscious understanding, or what to speak of Krishna conscious practice throughout our lives, that's described as being the most extraordinary, difficult event. Because when you think about it, these bodies that we're currently inhabiting, this is all that we've known in this lifetime. This is all that we've known. And how do we function in this body, or how do we, how does the body function, if you like? In that sense, now I'm talking. And then people can hear that. So we have this ability to hear, we have the ability to see, we have the ability to touch, we have the ability to taste, we have the ability to smell, like that. So the 5 gross senses of the body. And all our lives, those senses is how we functioned, how we've communicated, how we've connected through those senses. But of course, at the time of death, the soul is leaving the body. It's being yanked out of the body. For someone in pure spiritual consciousness, it's being liberated from the body and going back to Krishna. But for somebody who has no spiritual consciousness or very little whatever, and essentially they're absorbed in material consciousness, it's not that they're feeling that they're being liberated. The feeling is that they're being yanked out of something that they're attached to, that they want to stay in and continue with the only thing that they've known all of their lives, like that. And that's why Krishna tells us in the Bhagavad Gita, Vishaya vinivartante nirarahasya dehina rasarvajam rasopyasya param drisvar nivartate. And Krishna's explaining that though the embodied soul may be restricted from sense enjoyment, so if we accept the point, just on a pure philosophical basis, we accept the point that, it's attachment to the senses that is causing us this grief and this pain and this suffering. So therefore, we want to disconnect from that attachment to the senses. So we restrict our sense enjoyment. We restrict all the things that we might touch that are unnecessary, all the things that we might see, hear, taste, smell, etc. We restrict those things that are unnecessary. So Krishna's saying, though us, the embodied soul, may be restricted from sense enjoyment, simply by doing that, ceasing those engagements like that, that's not enough, because the pull and the attraction is still there for some engagement with the senses. So Krishna's solution to that is, yes, you don't just restrict it, you don't just stop it, you do continue engaging the senses, but you engage them in the service of the Supreme. And it's from that engagement we derive a higher taste. And by getting that higher taste, we become fixed in our consciousness. And it is interesting, the example is often given that, if somebody's in prison and the prison food or whatever is really, not very nice or not very, I'm sure it's different now, but the example that's given in ancient times is kind of like, you get some stale, not even ancient times, maybe just some decades ago, or 100 years ago, you would get some stale bread and that would be kind of your food, like that. So something like that. But then if you're given a beautiful plate of prasadam, vegetarian food that's been sanctified, spiritually sanctified, and there's beautiful preparations there, so you have some nice rice and dal, some lovely subjis, some pakoras, some samosas, and then to finish it all off, some gulab jamans and sweet rice and different wonderful things like that. That's a higher taste. Why would you be attracted to the stale bread ever again? You wouldn't be. So likewise, we may engage ourselves in material things, but that engagement is considered to be like that stale bread. But when we engage our senses in the service of the Supreme, the service of Krishna, then that's like that glorious prasadam feast like that, and we will never be attracted again to the. So while it may seem, when we don't have the alternative, it may seem that lesser thing, stale bread, is attractive, but actually it's not once it's replaced with something superior. So that's why Krishna's giving these examples and trying to explain to us how to solve our issues, our big issues in this material world, the loss of loved ones and ultimately the leaving and the loss of our own bodies like that. That's why Krishna's doing that. But of course Krishna, he can only advise us. He never forces us. If he was to force us, that would literally 100% compromise our ability to have a loving relationship with him, because love has to be spontaneous and natural. It cannot be forced like that. So yes, as I say, Krishna, he's giving us advice, but ultimately we have to listen. We have to listen to the advice, take the advice like that. And there's one interesting little anecdote about a man who's deaf, but kind of refusing to accept that he's deaf. So he's in his house, and he's in whatever, one of the rooms, and his wife's in another room, whatever that may be. And he's calling her, please dear, come, whatever he needs, something like that. And his wife, maybe she's in the kitchen in the middle of cooking a meal or something like that, and she can't come immediately. So the wife is responding and saying, yes, just a minute, dear, I'll be there in a minute. But because the husband is deaf or near deaf like that, he's not hearing her. So then he's thinking to himself, God, that woman must be deaf, I've been calling her for ages and she still hasn't come like that. So it's kind of interesting that, and then the wife will come and say, here I am, what's wrong, etc., etc. And he would complain, that he hasn't heard her, or she hasn't heard him, but it's him that hasn't heard her like that. So it's like that, we have to hear somehow or another. That kind of example is where it's kind of obvious. Well, he obviously, is deaf and not accepting it. But the analogy is kind of the same. Krishna's giving us that advice. In that verse that I just referred to about having a higher taste. I mean, I've known that verse for the best part of 40 years at this stage. But the resistance to hear it, and the resistance to you hear it, to fully accept it, to absorb it like that. There's always this resistance that's taking place. So just as that man, was deaf and wasn't hearing his wife, Krishna comes. He comes in unlimited incarnations. Next week we'll be celebrating the incarnation Lord Nrsingadev like that, and the wonderful pastime associated with that. But it's described that Krishna's incarnations are unlimited. You literally cannot count them. They are just unlimited, and they're constantly Krishna's coming to try to retrieve us from this material world and from all the difficulties that we find ourselves in. But even in terms of his physical, if you like, incarnations, he also comes in different forms. He comes in the form of his books. So that verse is from Bhagavad Gita. But do we hear it? Do we accept it? Do we absorb it? Do we actually follow it like that? Then he also comes in the form of his holy name. So Krishna actually is reaching out in so many ways all the time to try to help us to reconnect with our spiritual side and reconnect ultimately with him. But he won't force us, and rightly so. So we have to hear it like that. We have to hear it, and that can be the challenge, or that it very much is the challenge for us. Because why is it such a challenge? Because we are attached to our senses, and even though, as I've just given the example, that you can compare them to stale bread, somehow or another, we're still finding that stale bread attractive. We haven't quite started to taste, the beautiful subjis and samosas, etc. What to speak of the sweet rice. we haven't quite tasted that. So there's still that attraction there. And you know, Prabhupada gives examples about that. You know, there's one nice story about a doctor visiting a house, a wealthy house actually, where you have a very wealthy lady owner, and she has her maidservant, and the doctor comes, and because there's fever in the town or whatever, so the doctor comes to check them, and he checks them, and the owner of the house, the lady, you know, she's fine, no problem whatsoever, but the maidservant has a very, very high fever. So the doctor, you know, is focusing all on her, giving all his attention to her and looking after her, etc. And the owner of the house is thinking, hang on a sec, I'm the owner, I'm the main person here, you know. I should be the one with the fever and getting all this attention. You know, why the hell is my maidservant the one who's getting it? So it's kind of like the material world. Who wants a fever? We don't want a fever. Fever's a bad thing, you know. But somehow or another, there's some attraction to that. In this case, you know, because all the doctor's giving all the attention to the person who is sick, like that. So somehow or other, we've got to bridge this gap from thinking that the stale bread is attractive, and Krishna does tell us also in the Bhagavad Gita later on, actually in the 18th chapter, he tells us, you know, yattadagre visham iva, and he's explaining that which in the beginning may taste like or be like or feel like poison, but at the end is nectar, and which awakens us to self-realization. That's happiness in the mode of goodness. So Prabhupada explains in the purport to that verse that, you know, when you're attracted to a horrible thing, and there's that example given of when Lord Indra took birth as a hog, or a pig, if you like, you know, and what do pigs do? We don't really see pigs much in Ireland in that sense. You have to specifically go to a farm. But if you go to some other countries where there's wild pigs, including India, you'll see them. And every time I've seen them, at least, what are they doing? They've got their face, you know, in a sewer, basically, you know, eating the stool and drinking, you know, that horrible, you know, sewage water, which is all sorts of horrible things, including urine. So the pig has got his snout, if you like, in the trough, and that's what it's eating. Now Lord Indra, you know, he you know, that's the whole pastime where he had to take the body of a pig. They can't hear. They can't. You know, you can go to them and tell them, no, I mean, this is horrible. This is the stale bread. This is stale bread par excellence. You know, so leave it alone. Don't be bothering yourself with that. But they can't hear, because of the body they're in, etc., and the pull of the senses and all of that. So the explanation is that that which is what tastes like nectar in the beginning, so the stale bread or the pigs, it's actually poison, and it's no good for us, etc., etc. But that's what tastes like poison in the beginning, because it becomes nectar, you know, and that's Krishna consciousness. So the reason that it feels a little poisonous in the beginning is because we spent unlimited time in this material world, absorbing our senses in all of these material things. And like the pigs, giving that example, we've become used to that, and we're thinking that's a nice thing. So when we change that, when we try to change course, then that initial change may be difficult, and generally is difficult. But very shortly, and you know, we say armed with knowledge, you know, and particularly we have the knowledge behind to understand what's happening. If we endure that transitional stage, then very quickly we get to the poison feeling like nectar. And then once we get to that stage, and it's the real nectar, the nectar of Krishna consciousness, then it stays with us forever, and we will never go back, ever go back to that lower taste that's binding us here to the material world. So that's what's happening here. Yudhisthira is lamenting all these losses, but he's also understanding them in context. And as long as we can do that, not just with the losses that we have around us, but the loss that we will be facing in due course of time, and that we can put that in context and practice. That's the thing. Practice makes perfect. Prepare now while we still have a clear understanding, because who knows what the situation might be, when we're on our deathbed. So practice now as best as we possibly can to prepare ourselves for that, so as that we won't feel like we're being yanked out of the body, and please don't do this, I want to still stay in contact with my senses, that we won't feel that experience, but rather we will feel that experience that great devotees experience when they're leaving their body, that it's liberation, that it's the most wonderful thing that could possibly ever happen to them. Okay, I think I will stop there. Don't want to go on too long. So have a nice day, wherever you're listening. If it's in Dublin, bring the umbrella, because it's still raining. And hopefully I will see you again soon. Okay, thank you all very much. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai, Srimad-Bhagavatam Ki Jai, Hare Krishna Jai.